Samurai duels. They occupy a pretty unique place in history. It's a mix of deadly combat and those old ideals of honor and skill. And there's plenty of them peppered throughout Japanese history, whether we're talking about famous clashes between renowned masters, or a few of the obscure contests that are recorded in those fading chronicles. But they were more than just simple fights. Each duel was a drama of honor and strategy, and they often ended in a single stroke. So to understand it all, we can't just explore the duels themselves on a surface level, but we have to take a look at the culture that made such showdowns possible. There is that formal etiquette preceding a duel, all the way to the psychological games and rigorous training that decided its outcome. The sword duels were a moment of truth for warriors bound by the code of Bushido. So, somewhat inspired by our previous pistol duels video, let's talk about samurai duels today. This ought to be interesting, don't you think? But of course, as is tradition, allow me to open the video with the traditional welcome and the thank you to those keeping everything ad-free, not just on this video, but every other video on the channel. That's the Patreon members, the YouTube members, those who checked out the merch store, and of course the occasional donation through YouTube Super Thanks and the PayPal link, all of them in the pinned comment and the video and channel description. If you can afford to support, thank you very much. If you can't, I don't blame you. Everything sucks at the moment. It's best that you save your money. Things are going to get worse before they get better, I'm afraid. Hate to be a doomer. But if you want to do us a solid, then just give the like, comment, subscribe, hit the hype button, tell your friends. That doesn't cost anyone anything, and it really helps out the channel. So thank you very much in advance. Now, with all that being said, let's not say anything more about it and just get on with it. Let's begin. So we think about the duel in samurai culture, and of course it comes along with these strict protocols. A samurai's reputation was often tied to his conduct in such life-or-death encounters, so elaborate etiquette evolved to ensure that even a fatal contest would be seen as honorable and not just some kind of bloodbath. Formal challenges were typically issued and accepted with a great amount of ceremony. It was common for a challenge to be delivered through a letter or a messenger, and phrased with quite a bit of respect, too. Now, ignoring or refusing a legitimate duel, that was seen as, a stain on one's honor. A stain as deep as defeat in combat would be. In fact, even worse, it's better to die in an honorable way than to flee like a coward. So once a challenge was accepted, both parties agreed on a time and a place. It was often a secluded spot, or the courtyard of a shrine, to avoid interruptions and any public disorder. For instance, the famous 1612 duel, which we will get to, between Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojirō, was arranged via an intermediary, Lord Hosokawa's vassal, and set on a remote island to prevent any interference. It was agreements like that that ensured the duel was seen as a legitimate trial of skill, rather than just a chaotic brawl. Upon meeting, the duelists generally observed ritual courtesies. They might bow to each other, or perform symbolic gestures, acknowledging mutual respect. Now, in many accounts, samurai removed heavy armor for a duel, and they fought in their everyday clothing. Now, this seems a bit counterintuitive, but it actually was meant to ensure that victory came from skill alone, not from superior protection. The choice of weapon was sometimes agreed on in advance, especially if one or both duelists were adept with unusual arms. Most often it was the katana, that revered longsword. But there are cases of duels fought with spears, staffs, or the even shorter wakizashi, but this would be mutually decided upon in advance. Ensuring both sides had comparable weapons kept the duel fair by the standards of the day. Once battle was joined, unwritten rules of honor and skill applied. Interference from spectators was strictly forbidden, and any attendants present were expected to watch silently, unless required to certify the outcome. Duels typically concluded when one combatant was either killed or incapacitated. A samurai would rather die fighting than yielding. According to the Bushido ethos that prized courage unto death, this was the best way to go. But there were a few rare occasions where a duel ended without a clear victor. For example, if both parties agreed to a draw, or survived after exchanging blows. The opponents might bow again as a sign of mutual respect. Now this signaled that honor had been satisfied by the attempt alone. Crucially, even the winner was expected to show decorum. Gloating over a slain enemy or mutilating a downed foe could be seen as quite a disgrace. Contemporary chronicles describe victors bowing or offering a moment of silence for the fallen. So in short, from first challenge to final outcome, the duels were enveloped in ceremony that elevated them above mere street fights. They were, in the ideal, a test of character, as much as they were of swordsmanship. But let's not talk too much about the general culture around sword duels. Let's talk about some of the actual duels now. And we'll begin from one of the earliest and most celebrated in Japanese lore. That is the encounter between young Ushiwakamaru, the future samurai general Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and the warrior monk Benkei. Though it is wrapped in legend, the story from the late 12th century shows core themes of honor, skill, and loyalty, things that certainly echo through later duels. Benkei, a fearsome monk over 2 meters tall, had stationed himself on Kyoto's Gojo Bridge each night, determined to collect 1,000 swords by defeating passing samurai. According to the 14th century chronicle Gikeiki, Benkei had amassed 999 swords through duels when he met a flute-playing youth carrying a gilded blade. What a prize! Well, the young man was actually Yoshitsune, or at the time known as Ushiwakamaru, who was a noble in disguise. Of course, Benkei sensed a worthy challenge, and he demanded the youth's sword. Ushiwakamaru lured Benkei off the bridge to an open space, or in some accounts, onto the bridge itself, under the moonlight, where they dueled, which is a little bit more dramatic. Now the contrast in styles was pretty huge too. Benkei wielded a massive naginata, which is kind of like a halberd, and he used it with raw strength, heavy attacks, this kind of thing. While Ushiwakamaru, much smaller and quicker, relied on agility and speed. In a flurry of movement, remembered in countless plays and prints, the young samurai dodged Benkei's heavy strikes, and eventually struck the monk down, knocking the weapon from his hand. Defeated, for the first time after 999 victories, Benkei did not lose his life. Short-term consequences of the duel were pretty immediate and profound. Benkei, frustrated yet impressed by the loss, attempted a rematch by ambushing Yoshitsune at the Kiyomizu temple shortly afterward. But he was bested for a second time. Of course, the second defeat extinguished his will to fight against Yoshitsune. Instead, he asked to serve again. Yoshitsune accepted, of course, gaining Benkei as a lifelong retainer. And thus, a potentially deadly duel transformed into a legendary friendship. Benkei became Yoshitsune's staunchest ally in the Genpei War from 1180 to 1185 and beyond. Culturally, the duel at Gojo Bridge came to symbolize the ideal of strength bowing to honor. Medieval storytellers celebrated how Benkei's arrogance was humbled by a better swordsman, and how he redeemed his honor by switching sides. But the tale also highlights the notion that true samurai worth transcends size or status. A youth of noble spirit and superior training, Yoshitsune had trained in the art of war since childhood, by the way, could overcome even a giant warrior monk. In Yoshitsune's broader career, the duel is depicted as the moment he gathered the loyal followers needed to launch his campaign against the Taira clan. Benkei's unwavering service unto death added to an almost mythic aura of Yoshitsune's leadership. Now it is important to note, too, the historical records like the Azuma Kagami confirm Yoshitsune had a band of warrior monks aiding him, and that lends credence to a kernel of truth behind the Benkei legend. Although embellished by folklore, such as supernatural Tengu aiding Yoshitsune in some versions, the duel remains an iconic narrative of skill defeating brute force, and enmity turning into loyalty. For later generations of samurai, the image of Benkei kneeling to Yoshitsune after a duel was a powerful lesson. An honorable warrior respects greatness in others, even an opponent, and can transform shame into honor through loyalty and service. Thus, this early duel, though it is probably more legendary than historical, certainly set a template for the ethos of dueling in Japan's warrior culture. Well, let's move forward, and we find ourselves in the Sengoku period, which was certainly not known for being a peaceful time. 15th to 16th centuries, this is. We find real historical figures whose duels were recorded and celebrated. Let's talk about Tsukahara Bokuden, 1489 to 1571. That was one such figure. A master swordsman, often called a kensei, sword saint, for his extraordinary skill. Bokuden's life spanned a violent era of civil war. He is said to have fought dozens of duels and battles, without ever suffering a single wound. While some tales about him have a legendary flavor, and perhaps the aforementioned claim does too, contemporary samurai chronicles and later compilations include several of Bokuden's duels as exemplars of strategy and composure. One famous duel was Tsukahara Bokuden's encounter with Kajiwara Nagato, a master of the naginata. Remember we mentioned that's kind of like a halberd-like weapon. Well, as for Kajiwara, he was reputed to perform incredible feats, like cutting down fast-moving birds mid-flight with his halberd. When Bokuden faced Kajiwara, reportedly around 1520 at Kawagoe Castle, it was seen as a clash of two styles. Bokuden with his long sword, and Kajiwara with a crescent-bladed polearm. According to tradition, the fight was swift and decisive. Kajiwara lunged with his weapon, but Bokuden evaded the strike and closed in. And in one stroke, Bokuden sliced Kajiwara's face in half, defeating him instantly. It's pretty hard to recover from that one, isn't it? Well, some versions say that Bokuden first cut off the shaft of Nagato's naginata, demonstrating superior reach and timing, and then after that, delivered the fatal blow. The awe with which this duel was remembered speaks to Bokuden's tactical brilliance. He neutralized the advantage of Nagato's long weapon by daring to step inside its range at just the right moment. In the short term, victory over such a famed fighter enhanced Bokuden's renown and the prestige of his Kashima-based school of swordsmanship. Historically, Bokuden went on to become a tutor to great lords. He allegedly even taught the shogun Ashikaga Yoshitsune in the 1550s, so his duel victories clearly elevated his career. Another instructive duel of Bokuden's involved an opponent who fought one-handed. Now, as mentioned earlier, Bokuden psychologically toyed with his adversary by repeatedly protesting the duel, suggesting that using only one hand was cowardly. The one-handed swordsman, thinking Bokuden afraid, grew overconfident, and when the duel finally commenced, Bokuden exploited a brief opening, the complacency of his opponent, and he struck him down. This outcome reinforced Bokuden's reputation for winning with wit as much as weaponry. It also had a didactic effect. Manuals on swordsmanship later cited this anecdote to warn against pride and to illustrate psychological strategy. Bokuden's duels often did carry a philosophical message. The most famous story attached to him is the no-sword duel on the boat, although that incident ended bloodlessly. We might talk a little bit about it later. It was essentially Bokuden's way of proving a point, that true mastery could defeat an enemy without unsheathing steel. Well, Bokuden's dueling exploits fit into his broader era as well. The Sengoku period was marked by incessant warfare, but also by the development of formal martial arts. Swordsmen like Bokuden traveled widely. He undertook 3 great training journeys across Japan, and he synthesized knowledge from various schools. Each duel for him was both a test of opportunity to refine his style. His victories over rival masters helped propagate his Shinto-ryu teachings far and wide. Culturally, Bokuden became a folk hero by the Edo period. Stories of his clever duels were popular among a public that romanticized that bygone era. Yet the tales were rooted in real principles. They taught that presence of mind, adaptability, and restraint were the marks of a true samurai. Bokuden's own later life reflected this. He eventually eschewed lethal fights as he aged, focusing on teaching and even taking up Buddhist vows. Well, let's move on to another one. Not all duels ended in death or enmity. Some forged lasting bonds and influenced the course of martial arts. And a prime example is the meeting of Kamiizumi Nobutsuna and Yagyū Munetoshi, also known as Muneyoshi, around the mid-16th century. Now, Kamiizumi Nobutsuna, known as Kamiizumi Isinokami, was a renowned swordsman and founder of the Shinkage-ryu school. Yagyū Munetoshi was a skilled local lord who later became head of the Yagyū family school. Their encounter took place during the tumultuous Sengoku era, when martial prowess was highly valued by warlords. According to later Yagyū family records, Munetoshi sought out Kamiizumi after hearing of his fame, perhaps around 1563 when Kamiizumi was touring provinces, testing and teaching his style. The two agreed to a friendly duel or sparring match. Sources differ on whether it was a formal duel or more of a learning experience, but it was certainly a measured encounter, rather than a mortal grudge match. In their contest, both demonstrated extraordinary skill. One anecdote says that Kamiizumi disarmed Yagyū with a technique from the Shinkage-ryu school, but stopped his blade short of injuring him. Another version holds that the duel ended in a respectful way, with neither able to decisively best the other. What is constant is the aftermath. Deeply impressed, Yagyū Munetoshi humbled himself and became a student of Kamiizumi. Kamiizumi, in turn, recognized Munetoshi's potential and transmitted the core teachings of Shinkage-ryu to him. And this was a pretty important moment. Munetoshi went on to refine those teachings and establish the Yagyū Shinkage-ryu, which would become the official sword style of the Tokugawa shogunate under his son Yagyū Munenori. Thus a duel that began as a test of skill concluded with a legacy of knowledge-sharing and mutual honor. In the short term, the duel raised Munetoshi's stature. After training with Kamiizumi, Yagyū Munetoshi's reputation as a swordsman grew immensely, attracting the attention of Oda Nobunaga, and later Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. Munetoshi even earned a recording in clan chronicles for cutting down an enemy general in single combat during a battle, a feat perhaps emboldened by the confidence of his training. Not everyone gets to take out a general. Well, the Kamiizumi Yagyū encounter thus had concrete career consequences. It connected Munetoshi's clan to the rising Tokugawa, securing them a place as sword instructors, once the Tokugawa shogunate was established. But culturally, this duel exemplified the ideal of martial arts as a vehicle for self-improvement rather than destruction. But the fact that both masters walked away alive, and as allies nonetheless, was applauded in later writings. There is a popular saying attributed to Kamiizumi. It's perhaps apocryphal, but the quote goes, "The ultimate victory is when both winner and loser walk away better than before." And indeed, it's that philosophy that shrines in the records of their duel. It was less about vanquishing an opponent, and more about discovering better techniques, a mutual learning scenario. But within the broader era, such exchanges were not as common. As samurai schools proliferated, masters would often test each other in controlled bouts, with witnesses and rules, comparing styles. Kamiizumi himself was known for traveling to teach and learn. He even created a wooden sword with leather padding, an earlier Fukuro Shinai, to allow freer sparring without lethal injury. His duel with Yagyū Munetoshi can be seen as a kind of milestone in this culture of inter-ryu exchange. It significantly influenced the evolution of Kenjutsu, the synthesis of Kamiizumi, Shinkage-ryu, and Yagyū's own style, led to new techniques emphasizing timing, distance, and non-lethal control. Future generations held up this encounter as an example of the samurai virtue of humility. Munetoshi was not too proud to become a student after not the defeat, but I'm sure he was hoping for a victory. And that is, the foundational myth for the Yagyū lineage. So in summary, the Kamiizumi versus Yagyū duel shows how a meeting of swords could spark a partnership and lineage that shaped swordsmanship for centuries to come. All in all, what could have just been another bloody fight to the death turned out to be something that was beneficial for everyone. No losers, really. Everybody benefits. Okay, so next up, we have Itō Ittōsai Kakehisa, who lived from 1560 to, a lot of people think, 1653, which is pretty impressive, 93 years old. Another Sengoku-era swordsman, whose duels have kind of become the stuff of legend. Ittōsai was the founder of the Ito-ryu, the one-sword school, and he deliberately sought fame through dueling. It is said that during his warrior pilgrimage, in Japanese known as the Musha Shugyo, Ittōsai fought 33 duels without a single loss. A record, second only to Miyamoto Musashi. Some of these duels were to the death, but others were likely just to submission. One particularly storied duel of Ittōsai is his encounter with a rival named Mikogami Tenzen, also known as Munetoshi, who would later be known as Ono Jiroemon Tadaki. According to traditional account, Tenzen challenged Ittōsai while armed with a steel katana, whereas Ittōsai, for his part, used only a wooden bokken, which is just a wooden sword. Despite the apparent disadvantage, Ittōsai's skill was so refined that he defeated Tenzen without injuring him. Legend says he struck with such control that Tenzen realized he was at Ittōsai's mercy, though fortunately for him he was unharmed. Overwhelmed by Ittōsai's prowess and generosity in sparing him, Tenzen conceded defeat and became Ittōsai's disciple. This duel thus directly resulted in the transmission of Ittōsai's style to Ono Tadaki, who in time succeeded him and became a sword instructor to the Tokugawa shogun. And here again, a duel's aftermath was not revenge or bitterness, but teaching and legacy. Just how it should be. Another famous episode in Ittōsai's story is the succession duel he orchestrated between his top two students. In his old age, Ittōsai had to choose an heir to lead the Itō-ryu. Instead of selecting one himself, he left a letter instructing his disciples, by then masters in their own right, of course, to duel each other for the inheritance of the school. The duel came down to Ono Tadaki, the same Tenzen by then renowned, and a peer of his. They fought a fierce duel in front of Ittōsai's residence. Ono Tadaki emerged victorious, thus becoming the second head of Itō-ryu, while the other disciple was gravely wounded. Some accounts say he was killed. Well, this method of succession by duel showed once again the ethos that true skill has to be proven in combat, even within a family of students, if we're going to use that terminology. That's pretty much the closest you could get, I suppose. It did cement Ono's legitimacy, but it also showed the harsh realities of samurai loyalty and ambition. Students of the same master were willing to risk death for the sake of honor and leadership. In the context of Ittōsai's era, his numerous duels contributed to the fame of his style. The Itō-ryu philosophy was that a single decisive cut should end an engagement, a principle born out by Ittōsai's habit of finishing duels with one stroke. His successors, the 33 victories, gave credence to this emphasis on an overwhelming initial attack. And indeed, Ittōsai's preferred technique was said to involve a spontaneous, no-thought strike, called musouken, or dream thrust. Well, it capitalized on an almost instinctual timing, certainly very difficult to master. The short-term consequences for many of Ittōsai's opponents were fatal, but the broader consequence was the spread of his school. By the early Edo period, the Itō-ryu became one of the most influential sword schools, partly thanks to its integration into the Tokugawa establishment via Ono Tadaki. Culturally, Ittōsai is remembered as an embodiment of the duelist spirit, fiercely independent, restless, and convinced that the truth of swordsmanship lays in actual combat. Tradition holds that as a young man he even accepted the challenge of a mysterious stranger at a shrine and killed him in one blow, later realizing that that man was his own first teacher who had staged a final test, which is pretty awkward. Well, such tales certainly feed the image of Ittōsai as a swordsman who lived and breathed the unforgiving logic of the duel. So we can say that Itō Ittōsai's duels, whether defeating Tenzen or ensuring his school's future through a duel, show the era's belief that sword mastery was a mortal trial, and also how structured dueling could shape the leadership of martial traditions. And now moving on, it's what you've all been waiting for. You can't talk about samurai duels without Miyamoto Musashi, Japan's most legendary swordsman. While his 1612 duel with Sasaki Kojirō, which we'll cover next, is the most famous, Musashi's series of duels with the Yoshioka family in 1604, I think, is equally significant. These encounters don't only show Musashi's tactical genius and his general air of ferocity, but also a lasting impact on the fate of a prominent sword school. It all starts in 1604. Musashi was a young ronin, around 20, perhaps 21 years old, on his warrior pilgrimage. Arriving in Kyoto, he sought out the Yoshioka school of swordsmanship, which had been one of the capital's most respected fencing academies. The head of the school, Yoshioka Seijuro, was a master swordsman and a proud samurai of distinguished heritage. Musashi issued a formal challenge, which after some negotiation by letters was accepted. And so they agreed to duel on the dry riverbed outside of Kyoto. True to Musashi's by now characteristic style, he showed up late, keeping Seijuro waiting and undoubtedly tense. When Musashi finally arrived, the duel was fought with wooden swords. Once again, boken, do remember that word, a practice often used to avoid a fatal outcome when reputation rather than life was at stake. The two circled each other carefully. Musashi then exploded into action and delivered a powerful blow to Seijuro's shoulder. Well, the strike hit true, and it shattered his shoulder and left arm, which basically meant he was useless. Seijuro then fell unconscious, although he did survive, but the injury was so severe that it effectively ended his entire swordsman career. He was unable to hold a sword again. Poor guy. Well, Musashi had thus defeated the head of the Yoshioka school in one stroke, without killing him but certainly incapacitating him. The immediate consequence was shock and outrage in the Yoshioka family. Seijuro's honor, and that of the entire school, now demanded retaliation. His younger brother, Yoshioka Denshichiro, stepped up to a challenge, and he would aim to avenge the head of the school and, well, sort Musashi out. A second duel was arranged shortly thereafter, this time at another location outside Kyoto. On this occasion, Denshichiro armed himself with a formidable weapon, a staff with a heavy steel ball and chain, kinda like a kusarigama or a similar flail-like weapon. This choice hints that Denshichiro meant to kill Musashi outright, since such a weapon in a duel indicates deadly intent rather than a friendly match. You don't show up with one of them unless you really mean business, I suppose. But Musashi arrived late again. Denshichiro was pretty angry at this, and when they did eventually fight, Musashi reportedly used 2 wooden swords, or at least improvised against the chain and sickle technique. He successfully disarmed Denshichiro of the chain weapon, and then immediately struck him down, killing Denshichiro with his own steel sword. In 2 bouts, Musashi had now eliminated 2 heads of the Yoshioka school. The first one he just maimed. The second one was not so lucky. The Yoshioka clan, now led by a youth, the next heir, Matsa Shichiro, was only about 12 years old, was furious and desperate, and I don't think the 12-year-old was going to be challenging Musashi to a duel anytime soon. Well, they resorted to a less honorable resolution. They figured they'd set a trap for Musashi. Matashitsuro, issued a challenge to Musashi to have a third duel, hoping to save face and technically continue the tradition. The duel was to take place at dawn near Ichijoji Temple, by a pine tree on the outskirts of Kyoto. Musashi, likely suspecting treachery, came very early to the rendezvous, which is a reversal of his usual tardiness. Concealing himself in the surrounding foliage, he observed from hiding as the Yoshioka side arrived in force dozens of armed retainers, the boy accompanying the boy Mata Shichiro, clearly intending to ambush or overwhelm Musashi with sheer numbers. Well, it all seemed pretty obvious. Musashi realized that if he tried to face them honorably at the appointed time, he would certainly be just killed by the mob. It was not looking good. Therefore, he chose a characteristically bold strategy. He launched a preemptive strike. Musashi burst forth from hiding and charged the group. He cut down the 12-year-old Mata Shichiro with a single blow, before the others could even react. Stunned by the sudden attack and death of their young master, the Yoshioka men faltered. Musashi then fought his way ferociously through them. Sources say he wielded both swords with such ferocity that he killed many, and the rest of them ran away, most likely screaming and waving their hands in the air above their heads, I assume. Well, no historical citation on that one. It's just my imagination, perhaps. Well, in modern retellings, though, this is the dramatic Ichijoji duel, where Musashi single-handedly defeated a small army. Some people even say that he faced 70 opponents. And while the numbers are likely exaggerated, Musashi's own writings hint at facing multiple foes and surviving by taking the initiative. In any case, by the end, the Yoshioka school was annihilated. Its leadership dead, its name disgraced by resorting to a failed ambush. A dishonorable end for the school. Now, as for Musashi, he walked away wounded but victorious. But his legend was made in Kyoto. Well, the consequences were pretty enormous for his reputation. He'd effectively destroyed one of the most esteemed martial lineages in the capital. The Yoshioka school collapsed after 1604, and it would never pose a challenge again. For Musashi personally, the victories cemented his status as a top-tier swordsman in Japan. Soon after, as records show, he was left unchallenged in Kyoto and resumed his travels, later taking on disciples and codifying his style. Culturally, the Yoshioka incident became a prime example of ruthless efficiency and cunning in dueling. Some later commentators criticized Musashi for striking down a child, that is, Mata Shichiro, remember he was 12 years old, and employing a form of trickery by arriving early. But I suppose Musashi's own view, as gleaned from the Book of Five Rings, was that strategy above all justified the actions. The ambushers, in his mind, had forfeited any claim of honorable conduct, and he simply beat them at their own game. If the rules were going to be playing dirty, well, he'd just play a little bit dirtier. So in the context of Musashi's life, the Yoshioka duels were certainly a turning point. After them, he never again faced such dire multiple odds. Well, except in warfare, perhaps, but not in a dueling sense. It might have influenced his later philosophy, too, to avoid needless death. It is said that after another decade of dueling, Musashi achieved a kind of spiritual awakening and swore off lethal duels. And indeed, by around 1612 to 13, his mindset seems to have shifted towards finding perfection beyond killing, as he realized that constant mortal combat would eventually claim him too. What's that old saying? You live by the sword, you die by the sword. So let's move on to another one of Musashi's duels. And yes, I'll do a video just on Musashi, but today we're just talking about his duels, okay? It's perhaps the most famous samurai duel ever, not just for Musashi, but just in general, and that is his duel against Sasaki Kojirō on April 13th, 1612. Taking place on a remote island offshore of northern Kyushu, this encounter has been romanticized quite a bit, so little bit of imagination. Let's not take everything as gospel, but contemporary accounts and clan records do verify the key details. The argument is in the specifics. What we do know is both Musashi and Kojirō were by then renowned as expert swordsmen, very much a good match for each other. In terms of sword duels, not in any other way, I assume. Don't take that the wrong way. Well, Musashi was about 28 and quite fresh from years of duels, including that Yoshioka triumph. And Sasaki Kojirō, nicknamed Ganryu, rock style, or the demon of the western provinces, was around 30 or 40. The accounts vary, and he was famed for his exceptional sword technique. Kojirō wielded a particularly long katana, often described as a nodachi, a field sword, and he actually had a name for it too. He called it mono hoshiza, drying pole, that means. He developed a signature move, the tsubame gaeshi, swallow reversal cut, an agile twisting strike, reputed to mimic a swallow's sudden change of direction mid-flight. By 1612, Kojirō was serving under Lord Hosokawa Tadaoki and had his own dojo in Kokura. Things were going pretty well for him, and the duel with Musashi came about when Musashi, eager to challenge the best of the best, petitioned Hosokawa through an intermediary to arrange a formal match. The location agreed upon was Ganryujima, a small island in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu, named after Kojirō's style, by the way. He was the local champion. Official witnesses were present, Hosokawa's retainer, Nagaoka Sado, among others, indicating this was recognized as an honorable duel, not just a street fight between rivals. Kojirō arrived on the beach at the appointed time, accompanied by officials, and then they waited. Musashi, however, in his typical style, delayed his arrival by several hours, and this ploy was calculated, as noted earlier. It was meant to irritate and unnerve Kojirō. And by the time Musashi's boat was sighted, Kojirō was not in a very good mood. They say he was visibly angry with being kept waiting. Musashi had also prepared in an unusual way. En route to the island, he carved a long wooden sword, a boken, from an oar. He stepped onto the beach armed with this oversized wooden weapon, looking disheveled. He'd overslept and not even tied his headscarf properly, according to legend. Kojirō bristled at what he perceived to be disrespect. It is said that upon seeing Musashi's makeshift weapon, Kojirō cast away his own sword's sheath in contempt. Musashi seized the psychological initiative and coolly remarked, "You've already lost, Kojirō. A samurai who throws away his sheath means he won't return alive." Well, this comment, recorded in various forms in later texts, only served to make Kojirō even angrier. When the duel commenced, the combatants bowed and took their stances. Kojirō drew back his long blade. Musashi raised his wooden oar sword. Kojirō allegedly struck first, unleashing a swift overhead cut, possibly his famed swallow technique. But Musashi dodged it, and in a split-second counterattack, he swung his oar with full force at Kojirō's head. Well, this time the blow struck true, with a sickening crack, as Musashi's oak bokken, longer than Kojirō's metal sword, found its mark right on Kojirō's skull. Contemporary chroniclers say that Kojirō collapsed, fatally wounded, with a smashed skull or temple. And just like that, Musashi had won, with a single stroke once again. But to make sure, Musashi reportedly struck again, breaking Kojirō's ribs as well, though it appears Kojirō was likely killed by the first strike. Probably wasn't necessary. In any case, that's what he did apparently. Well, according to one account, Musashi, seeing Kojirō's supporters agitated, ready to fight them as well, and even brandished Kojirō's sword that was stuck in the sand. But they must have thought better of it, because the witnesses restrained themselves. Musashi quickly retreated to his boat, wary that Kojirō's retainers might seek revenge. They did not. Perhaps they were awed, or maybe they were constrained by Hosokawa's presence. In any case, the duel was over in mere moments, but it instantly entered the annals of samurai history. Well, the short-term outcome was pretty clear. Sasaki Kojirō was dead, and with him died the brightest star of the Ganryu school. Musashi's victory was acknowledged by the officials on site, Lord Hosokawa himself, though he had lost his top sword instructor, reportedly praised Musashi's skill, but, well, disapproved of his rough manners. Musashi, for his part, felt a profound impact from the duel. Some sources suggest that killing Kojirō was a turning point that led Musashi toward introspection. One 17th century record claims that Musashi attained a kind of enlightenment after Ganryujima, and resolved never to fight another duel to the death. And indeed, after 1612, Musashi's recorded duels were either non-lethal or merely just sparring. He turned his focus to military service and later to teaching and writing. Culturally, the Musashi-Kojirō duel became legendary almost immediately. It was seen as the ultimate contest between two styles, Musashi's unconventional two swords and psychological tactics versus Kojirō's elegant and traditional technique. The duel has often been characterized as symbolizing a generational or perhaps even a philosophical shift. Musashi, the untamed ronin who breaks the rules, triumphs over Kojirō, the established school prodigy. It almost seems like a street-smart versus book-smart kind of situation. In any case, for Musashi's broader career, defeating Kojirō was the crowning duel that sealed his legacy as Japan's greatest duelist. He had now defeated numerous challengers, and the most famed rival of his time. The final boss, I suppose. Interestingly, Musashi's life after the incident saw him take service under lords, and even fight in actual battles. He was present at the siege of Osaka in 1614–15, but he didn't get much particular glory from that. Eventually, he settled down to write the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, in 1645, for all of us to enjoy to this very day, passing on his strategic wisdom. In that treatise, he doesn't mention Kojirō by name, but he emphasizes concepts clearly born from these experiences. The importance of rhythm, of observing without preconceptions. Musashi noted that one should see broadly rather than look narrowly at an opponent, and of using any means to gain victory. The duel on Ganryujima also had a local legacy. The island was later renamed Ganryu Island after Kojirō's style, and to this day it commemorates the fight with statues of the two combatants, locked in pose. But alright, we can't just talk about Musashi the whole time. Let's move on. As Japan settled into the peaceful Edo period, formal duels became quite less frequent. But samurai still found occasion to have their quarrels and vendettas. One celebrated example from the Genroku era, this is late 1600s, is the duel at Takadanobaba in Edo, that's the old name for Tokyo by the way, 1694, involving a young swordsman named Nakayama Yasubei. This duel was actually a skirmish born of a vendetta, and its fame comes from Yasubei's remarkable bravery and sword skill against multiple opponents. It's a slightly different flavor of duel, fair enough, but it's not really a one-on-one honor match, but legally sanctioned vendetta combat. Yet Edo-period chronicles treat it with the same reverence as a classic duel. Yasubei, who was about 24 at the time, was a talented swordsman training at a respected dojo in Edo. He had an uncle by bond, his dojo mate's foster father, named Sugano Rokurozaemon. What a last name that is. Well, he had a long-standing quarrel with a rival samurai, and this rivalry lured Sugano to Takadanobaba, then a suburb of Edo known for its horse grounds, under the pretense of an honorable duel. However, it was not honorable at all. Rather, it was a trap. The rival brought a band of armed retainers to ambush Sugano, and on the morning of March 6th, 1694, as Sugano arrived, he was set upon by multiple attackers. Nakayama Yasubei happened to learn of this treachery in the nick of time. In some versions, a quick-footed messenger from his dojo alerted him, and he rushed to the scene to save his uncle. What ensued was an epic fight. Yasubei plunged into the fray and faced the assailants almost single-handedly. Armed with his long katana and reportedly a shorter sword, he cut through the attackers with ferocious skill, despite the odds and the numbers. Historical records say that Yasubei killed at least 3 of the opponents himself, and wounded others, effectively routing the ambushers. His uncle Sugano was either saved or avenged. Accounts do differ on whether Sugano survived the initial attack. Some say Yasubei arrived just after his uncle was cut down, and thus avenged him by slaying the perpetrators. In the immediate aftermath, Nakayama Yasubei was the talk of the town. He had upheld loyalty and honor in classic samurai fashion, showing that even in an era of law and order, the spirit of the sword could blaze forth in righteous vengeance. Hell yeah. Well, honorably avenging one's kin was one of the few accepted reasons for sanctioned combat in Tokugawa times. You see, the government had a system for approving vendettas, and Yasubei's actions fell well and truly into that category. The duel at Takadanobaba was praised as a true example of Bushido in action, one man risking his life to uphold justice against treachery. And in practical terms, Yasubei was richly rewarded for his prowess. His fame from the incident reached the lords of the Ako domain, home of the 47 Ronin, nonetheless. One of the senior Ako samurai, Horibe, was so impressed by Yasubei's skill that he arranged to adopt Yasubei into his family. Yasubei then married Horibe's daughter and took the surname Horibe, becoming a retainer of Lord Asano Naganori of Ako. Thus, a direct consequence of the duel was Yasubei's rise in status from a Ronin son to a vassal of a prominent lord. A few years later, when Lord Asano was forced to take his own life by seppuku, the famous incident with Kira Yoshinaka in 1701, Horibe Yasubei, as he was then known, became one of the 47 Ronin who avenged their lord. He played a key role in that 1702 raid, his sword once claiming enemies again. After the successful vendetta against Kira, Yasubei and the other Ronin surrendered, and ultimately met their fate by taking their lives honorably in 1703. But still, it was the duel at Takadanobaba that had put Yasubei on the path into the Brotherhood of the 47 Ronin in the first place. In cultural terms, that incident has been immortalized in literature and drama, often as a prelude in plays about the 47 Ronin. It's, well, the quintessential symbolization of chivalry and heroism in the Edo period, a kind of late flowering of the dueling tradition in service of loyalty. Unlike earlier formal duels, this fight was chaotic and against uneven odds, yet it was enshrined because it exemplified the values of courage and fealty. People admired how Yasubei upheld the fight ethic that if one's comrade or family is unfairly attacked, a true samurai does not hesitate to sacrifice himself in battle, even under a regime that generally discouraged such privatized violence. The location, Takadanobaba, became famous, and even today has a stone marker that commemorates the site of the duel, and the story is retold as part of local lore. For the Edo samurai, Yasubei's deed was proof that the old samurai spirit was well and truly alive, just hidden under the clean kimono of a city swordsman. Now, in Yasubei's broader life, the deal was more of a pivot that turned a wandering swordsman into a house samurai with a fief, albeit briefly until the Arco incident. But it showed how personal combat could intersect with the legal norms of the time. You see, Yasubei was not punished for the killings. On the contrary, because it was seen as a legitimate vendetta defense, he was lauded for them. Therefore, this duel reflects how samurai dueling culture adapted in a peaceful era. It was still revered, but usually needing a pretty solid moral justification. Though we can say that Yasubei's exploit stands as probably the last great sword fight of the samurai age to capture widespread imagination. Of course, it links the classic ideals of dual honor to the emergent narrative of the 47 Ronin in their collective duel with destiny, which, well, that's a story that needs to be told in another video. And speaking of other videos, since this one is now over, perhaps you'd like to go watch another one, or listen to another one, or whatever we say. But our time together on this topic has come to an end. I would like to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, keeping everything ad-free, because we hate the ads. It's a kind of frothing at the mouth hatred, that kind of thing. So, special thank you to Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMS8 Change, Crystal. Oh, I've lost where I was. There we are. Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, David, Brittany, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakian, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolf's Vein, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Bestie, Hun, Stevie, and Jessica. And that's all of them so far. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, it's a pleasure. Lots of love to you all around the world. And I will see you in the next video. Good night for now. Sweet dreams.